Hi, Dr. Ando here. In today's lesson, we're looking at Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen. This is one of my favourite poems, and I've taught it time and time and again because I find it's just such a fantastic poem for teaching skills like literary analysis, how to identify techniques, how to annotate a work, how to assess how the intended audience and the purpose of the author is working in with the ideas that they're conveying. There's just so much packed into this poem. So there's just so much graphic imagery, so many different types of techniques. And Owen is just a master, in my mind, at how to use rhythm and the poetic form to not only convey ideas and to create such, vivid graphic imagery that really gets our attention, but also the way he uses aural devices or sound patterns in his work. So it's something I'm very passionate about. Wilfred Owen's work. Dulce et Decorum Est is probably one of his better known poems, but there are some others that I would also like to take a look at in later lessons as well. Anthem for Doomed Youth. Mental Cases is another one of my favourites. So, but I want to really focus on stanza one for this lesson because there's still so much to unpack. And in this lesson, yes, it's about poetry and it's about Wilfred Owen's work, but I also want to teach some processes for analysing a literary text in general, because it is a skill set that you can develop over time and with practice. And I do believe that it can be a little bit formulaic, even though it's English, and English is not so much black and white as it is abstract and grey in many senses. But I like to look first for the narrative voice, the tone, and the tense. They're the three things that in any text, when I'm first examining it, they're not the things that may jump to mind, but at first instance, but especially if you're analysing an unseen text, maybe in an exam, like a short answer or comprehension exam, and you have a text in front of you. There are three elements of a text that pretty much every text has. If it's even if it's non-fiction, but whether it's fiction or non-fiction, whether it's a poem or a piece of prose, whether it's an article, generally you will be able to look for the tense, the tone, and the narrative voice. So, and it will shift in Dulce et Decorum Est when we get to the later stanzas. But first, let's just have a look at some of those elements. So let's just start with the narrative voice and whether we get a sense of what that might be. So when we're talking about narrative perspective, we know we've got first, second, and third person narrative voice or narrative perspective. First person is when we have it's coming from the perspective of the persona or the speaker or the character. So, or the narrator. I, my, we in this instance. So when we're scanning the first stanza of Wilfred Owen, we will see that he's using this collective pronoun we. So there we get a sense that it's coming from the perspective of a soldier. He's there. He's with these people, these soldiers that we're witnessing here in the first stanza. He's one of them. He's speaking on behalf of the collective, of the suffering that these soldiers experienced. When the poem shifts later, we do get more of a sense of I and my, particularly in the second stanza, but here it's we. So immediately in the second line, the third line, the fourth line, it shifts to our, but he's speaking on behalf of the rest of the soldiers as well, and potentially those that don't have a voice because they lost their lives in war. So as a poet who's using the medium of poetry as a form of protest and as a vehicle for speaking on behalf of those that, whose voices were oppressed or lost altogether, those that didn't also have the courage to speak out against the government, to speak out against the propaganda, to put forward a different voice into the grand narrative of war. He's speaking on behalf of all of those people, and that's what it comes down to when we're looking at this collective use of we and our, that pronoun there. Later you'll also see in this poem that there is a shift to second person where he directly addresses those who are responsible for perpetuating these, glorified notions of war, the old lie, as he calls it. So that's our narrative perspective. Let's have a look at the tone. So the tone here, bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. The tone here, it's slow, it's melancholy. These people are sorrowful, they're somber. These are the words that come to mind. It's a grim reality here too. If we keep going, and towards our distant rest began to trudge, men marched to sleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on bloodshod. These men are suffering intensely. They're desensitized. They've been stripped of all of their vitality and their sensory experience. They're so worn down by the incessant brutality, the barrage of noise that comes with life on the battlefield, that they don't even respond to it anymore. They're drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. They don't even flinch now when they hear bombs being dropped, because they're so used to it. It's just such a part of their day-to-day experience. So when you're thinking about the tone of this first stanza, which is quite different to the second stanza, which explodes into the action of a gas attack. Here, somber, melancholy, grim. You can talk about those sorts of adjectives to describe the tone. The third element that I like to look for when I'm first examining a text is the tense. So we have past, present, and future tense. Past tense is obviously when we're looking back on the past. So the narrator is looking back and reflecting on a past experience, or recounting an event with the benefit of hindsight. We have the words turned, signalet, cursed, began rather than begun. These words marched. So if it was in present tense, where it's happening right here and now, then we would get words like we curse through the sludge, we turn our backs, men march asleep. So here we've got a very clear past tense. Sometimes the tense can shift in a text, but generally once it's in a particular tense, the text will stay in that tense. And so throughout Dulce et Decorum Est, we'll see that it is always in past tense throughout the entire poem. The next aspect of a text that I like to consider is the context. So that could be the historical, political context, the social or cultural context, the personal context of the author. It could be the philosophical or the literary context. For this particular text, I would say that most pertinent are the historical context, being it's written during World War One, the political context at the time, so the way that the British government was using propaganda to send very clear political messages to the populace. The cultural context as well, the social and cultural context as well, in the sense that when we're thinking about the early 1900s, very, very different to today. People were vastly more sheltered than we are today. We have become far more desensitized to graphic depictions of death and war. We see the news on a day-to-day basis if we allow ourselves to. It's there to access. These people in the early 1900s only had access to the messages that were being put forward by the government and by the media. So people could be influenced by these messages that the government were putting forward. Owen wanted to challenge those glorified patriotic notions of war as this glorious adventure, as though, going to war and fighting and dying for your country was an honor, that you would, die with dignity and honor intact. These were the falsehoods that he wanted to expose as lies, as the old lie, as he calls it. Now, these kind of anti-war sentiments weren't common at the time. In that era, people didn't readily speak out against the government. Often they didn't even have enough information to realise that they were being lied to. So we see that Owen is taking quite a dramatic and radical stance as a poet. Uh, this is a medium that's a vehicle, really, that he's using to speak out against the government and against what he perceives to be these falsehoods. The people back home in England really didn't have access to these kinds of subversive voices. There was nobody else really speaking out at that time. Living today in this era, we understand anti-war protests. We've seen them. The rise of the anti-war movements in the 70s. We're living in an era where we can quite easily scrutinise, the downsides of war. We are very aware through the mass media of the brutality and the horrors of war and death in war. We're not, quite so easily manipulated into thinking that it is this, it is in any way glorious. But, back at this time when Owen was writing, poetry was really one of the only mediums, along with, radio was very popular, print forms of media like the newspaper. But other than that, there was nothing visual that could really convey this sense of horror and brutality. And so this is where poetry becomes a really powerful medium for conveying that horror in image form. And we see here, as we'll analyse shortly when we look at the graphic imagery that he's creating in this first stanza, just how important it is that these kinds of texts were being used as a political form of protest in an era where it was quite easy for the average person to remain silent. Now let's take a look at this imagery that I've been talking about. Let's have a look first at the first two lines of the poem. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge. The first thing that stands out to me here is the simile, the use of simile. There's one in the first line, one in the second. First of all, we've got an image of bent double, like old beggars under sacks. So here we've got an image of supposedly youthful, courageous soldiers who are actually aged before their years. They're hunched over. They look like old beggars, which is a very demeaning description of soldiers who have, dedicated and potentially sacrificed their lives for their countries. These are very contrasting images if we compare them to the image of the soldier in propaganda at the time. Knock-kneed, we've got that alliteration there, that recurring sound that grabs our attention, followed by another simile, coughing like hags. Hags is another demeaning image. It's not a masculine image, is it? These men are being reduced to old hags. They're stripped of their masculine heroism. They're coughing, so they're weak, they're ill, potentially diseased. They're not marching in a rhythmic procession. They're cursing through sludge. This is not a glorious experience here. This is something that's dehumanizing, and it's something that is reducing these men to something even subhuman. When we think about hags, they have a long history in literature of being almost subhuman. So Owen is really setting us up here, and especially when you look at the title, Dulce et Decorum Est, it's sweet and fitting, which follows the Pro Patria Mori, to die for your country. Intensely ironic, because here we have a patriotic slogan, which is immediately followed by these images of men who have been stripped of everything that once made them men. In the next lines, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs and towards our distant rest began to trudge. We see that Owen captures a very poignant moment in the poem. These lines really convey the sense of really intense exhaustion and weariness and the haunting nature of war. The haunting flares, the use of the word haunting suggests that the flares are not just illuminating the scene, but also carrying a kind of psychological weight. The flares may remind the soldiers of the constant danger and the horrors they face on the battlefield. The choice of haunting also adds an emotional depth to this description. It indicates that the impact of war goes beyond the physical. Really, we're getting to the emotional and the psychological effects of war as well. The soldiers are haunted by what they're experiencing, and they can't seem to escape, the ever-present threats that the battlefield brings them. And then we see the turned our backs and began to trudge. In these lines, the soldiers, it seems that upon seeing the flares and they turn away from them, which is an action that implies a desire to escape or avoid the harsh reality that the flares are illuminating. And the act of trudging itself, it reinforces that sense of weariness of the soldiers. It emphasizes the physical and mental burden that they carry. The word trudge also suggests a slow and laborious movement, which really highlights the difficulty of their journey as they're marching. So we see that these lines are really contributing to Owen's overall anti-war sentiment, portraying the soldiers as fatigued and haunted by the experience of battle. And the juxtaposition of the haunting flares and the distant rest creates this kind of stark contrast between the harsh present and the hope for relief from this exhaustion and this struggle, which really provides a sense of that brutality of war and that yearning for some semblance of peace, but they can't ever really achieve it. In the next lines, men marched to sleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on bloodshod, all went lame, all blind. Owen here vividly depicts the physical and the mental toll of war, emphasising their dehumanising effects on the soldiers. Men march to sleep, we've got this alliteration here, this opening phrase of these lines immediately sets a surreal and nightmarish tone. The idea of men marching while asleep suggests a state of utter physical and mental exhaustion. It's a metaphor. These men aren't really asleep, obviously. They're just so fatigued that they continue to move mechanically as though they're almost in a trance. This portrayal really underscores the brutality of war and the impact on the soldiers' well-being, which at this point is basically non-existent. Next, we say many had lost their boots but limped on, bloodshod, which is quite a graphic image of suffering. The loss of their boots signifies just how dire the conditions really are that these soldiers are facing. There's a lack of proper equipment, or their equipment has deteriorated. It no longer protects them from the harsh reality of the battlefield. And it just shows how harsh this environment really is. The term limped on conveys the soldiers that they're determined to keep moving despite their injuries, which almost, it evokes our pity. We see them as, they're determined to keep going. They're not stopping. They're not giving up. So in that way, yes, they are heroic because they're persevering, but they're utterly exhausted. They're only doing it as a means of survival. If they stop moving, then, perhaps they will lose their lives. So we get the sense that they're not so much moving, out of a sense of bravery and courage, but really just to stay alive and in that desperate hope that they will, at some point in the not too distant future, find that distant rest that they're so longing for. Bloodshod here is particularly powerful as well, sort of suggesting that their feet are bare and wounded, they're soaked in blood. This is a really vivid image that symbolises the sacrifices and the suffering that they're enduring. And the all went lame, all blind, which is, hyperbolic in a sense. It is an exaggeration. They're not actually lame and blind, but this repetition of all really emphasises the universality of their suffering as a collective, as a group. They're all suffering in this way. They're all so stripped of their senses and desensitized because of this harsh reality that they're enduring. And this idea that war has rendered them physically and metaphorically crippled. The use of lame and blind, it goes beyond the literal sense, and it indicates a loss of vitality, purpose, clarity. There's nothing of that, that life force left in these men. The soldiers are not just physically wounded, but spiritually, emotionally, mentally, they're broken by the horrors that they've witnessed. So these lines are also very much in support of Owen's protest, his anti-war sentiments, this anti-war narrative that he's using to portray war as a dehumanizing force that's really robbing these soldiers of their agency, their humanity, and any kind of sense of basic comfort. There's a vivid and very stark imagery which evokes our empathy as readers as well, and it prompts us to condemn this kind of senseless suffering that these soldiers are experiencing in the name of war. In the final lines of this stanza, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind, here Owen continues to depict the extreme physical and mental strain experienced by the soldiers on the battlefield. He's highlighting their exhaustion and also the insidious threat of gas attacks that these men can't seem to escape. Drunk with fatigue. Here we've got a metaphorical expression that really vividly captures the extent of the soldier's exhaustion. And I think that this comparison of being drunk suggests a loss of control, disorientation, almost a blurred sense of reality. And the soldiers are so overwhelmed by fatigue that their physical and mental capacities are impaired, which emphasizes just how inhumane the conditions are that they are enduring, and in deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind, despite the potential danger signalled by the dropping gas shells. The soldiers are so fatigued that they are deaf to the warning sounds. The use of hoots here, I think, also adds quite an eerie quality, as if the shells themselves have some kind of malevolent, evil presence. And the adverb softly also, it's not a gentle word here. It creates a more sinister contrast, suggesting a silent and stealthy descent of the deadly gas. And this line also, I think, shows the soldiers' vulnerability and the constant threat they face. Even when their senses are so dulled by exhaustion, they've still got this ever present, ever pervasive threat surrounding them. So together, I think these lines really intensify this portrayal of war as overwhelming and dehumanizing. The soldiers, who are so physically and mentally drained, become almost incapacitated. They're unable to respond effectively to the imminent dangers around them. And so here, I think Owen's vivid metaphors and his sensory details culminate here at the end of this stanza to convey the harsh realities of warfare in a way that really elicits our empathy, our sympathy, pity, compassion, for these soldiers who are caught in war's devastating grip. So now that we've had a good look at the ideas and the techniques that Owen is using in this first stanza, I have a focus question here for you, which is really a question that I would like you to use to write one nice body paragraph. So maybe 12 to 15 sentences, a little more, a little less, see how you go. But the question is, how does Owen use the medium of poetry to portray the harsh realities of life at war? So for answering this one, the ideas, feel free to rewatch this video and, jot down, make some notes of some of the ideas that I was discussing. But you can really focus on how Owen is really quite skillfully using the medium of poetry to so vividly portray these harsh realities of life at war. From his carefully chosen words and sensory imagery, he really creates a compelling and really quite distressing depiction of the soldiers' suffering. So you can look at the visual imagery, how he employs visual imagery to convey the physical appearance of the soldiers. You can look at those similes in the first lines, the like old beggars and the coughing like hags, which paint that really stark picture of the soldiers as worn out and dehumanized. You could, discuss how that visual description really quite immediately engages the reader and sets the tone for the poem. That could be a nice example to discuss as your first piece of analysis in this body paragraph. I'll discuss the structure of the body paragraph that I recommend you using in a moment as well. You could also focus for this question on Owen's use of similes and metaphors, which are quite strong in this first stanza. So how he uses these poetic devices to enhance the impact of his portrayal. So the phrases like cursed through sludge, men march to sleep, how they create really quite powerful comparisons that evoke a sense of struggle and the burden and this surreal atmosphere. The soldiers are not just walking, they're cursed, and they curse. And their march is akin to a dreamlike state. So lines that are very open to interpretation here. And I encourage you to have a go of creating your own interpretations as well. You could also focus on Owen's use of auditory imagery, his oral devices, sound patterns, from alliteration, assonance, auditory imagery that captures the sounds of war, imagery that appeals to the sense of hearing. So, for example, men march to sleep, you're not only visualizing their physical exhaustion, but also suggesting a haunting, almost ghostly quality to their movement. You've got the auditory element that enhances the reader's understanding of the soldier's fatigue. You've got the gas shells dropping softly behind. You've got the contrast as well that you could talk about with the title and the romanticised language of the Latin phrase, contrasted to the language that depicts the harsh realities of war throughout the poem, that, revealing that bitter truth behind that idealised rhetoric. And the first person perspective, you could also take a look at that if you like. How does Owen use the first person perspective? How does he draw on his own experiences as a soldier and depict those? How does that first person voice add authenticity and immediacy to this portrayal? So the soldiers they're not just distant figures that are dehumanized and faceless, but they're actually individuals that we can empathize with. These are real people and we can, see and feel and hear their suffering. And so, yeah, have a look at how you can maybe choose, say, 3 examples, 3 quotes, 3 techniques, to show really how Owen is employing a combination of vivid imagery, figurative language, and that personalised perspective to convey that, the really brutal conditions of war, and how through this medium of poetry he is compelling us as the reader to confront this grim reality behind the glorified perceptions of war, challenging these, patriotic notions of heroism and sacrifice, and really pointing the finger quite directly at the government, at those responsible for perpetuating the old lie. So think about, through this question as you write your body paragraph, how he's really using this medium of poetry as a vehicle for political protest. So this is a recommended body paragraph structure that you can use to answer this question. This is the body paragraph structure that I encourage all of my students to use, whether they're in Year 7, right through to Year 12, even at university. If they're studying English literature, they can still use a similar body paragraph structure. It really gives you the bones of what you need in each body paragraph when you are writing an analytical essay. So the first step in your body paragraph is to write your topic sentence. So this is a clear and conceptual statement, one sentence, that establishes the main idea or argument of your paragraph in relation to the question. So this is where you set up the what. What is this paragraph about? The next step that I like to do is the discussion. So this is where you introduce or establish the context, the values, the purpose, and the intended audience relevant to the text, relevant to the question. So this is 1 to 2 sentences that nicely frames your analysis. You're wanting to set up the why here. Why is the author writing this text? What are they hoping to achieve? What is their purpose? Who are they trying to speak to through their text? So this is where, for example, for Wilfred Owen, this is where you might do 1 to 2 sentences to just nicely set up some details about the political or the historical context as relevant. The idea that he was a captain in the British Army, he witnessed the atrocities of war firsthand. He was trying to speak out against the propaganda perpetuated by the British government to expose the harsh realities of war to the British public. The next step is really where the bulk of your paragraph will be. So I like to use the acronym TEAL. There's a lot of different ones, PEAL, STEEL, different schools, different teachers use different ones, but fundamentally it's the same process of analysis. I just add an extra E for evaluation, which I'll discuss in a moment. So for this, I would recommend choosing 3 pieces of textual evidence. So that's 3 quotes from the poem that you analyze in turn. So your first teal will be choose a technique that you want to discuss. The second E is example. So what is your example of that technique? Explain the effect. So what is the effect on the audience? What do you think the Owen is hoping to achieve through the particular language choices that he's making? And then evaluate. So evaluate the effectiveness. How effective is it? Can you offer any further insightful evaluations of, what Owen is using that technique for, or what, how does that speak to the audience? How effectively does that engage us, or what emotions does that evoke in us? So it's taking your analysis or your explanation of the effect another step further there in the evaluation. And then you link each of your pieces of evidence back to the question. So you can just echo the words of the question, but it's really just reinforcing for that particular piece of evidence, for that teal, why is this relevant to the question? Why have I chosen it, for this particular paragraph? And then this is really the how part. How is Owen doing this? How is he using the medium of poetry to convey the harsh realities of war? And then you do the same process for the next 2 examples. So, for example, teal 1, you might do bent double like old beggars under sacks. Your technique might be the simile. You might want to talk about how this creates a vivid image of the soldiers as aged and decrepit. They're aged before their years. They're hunched over like old beggars, which shows that they're vastly contrasting the youthful, heroic images of soldiers put forward by the propaganda. That could be your first teal. Your second one, you pick another quote and another technique. So if you wanted to, you could look at the knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge. You could analyse the simile used there, the alliteration in knock-kneed. You could talk about how the image of the old hags, strips the men of their, masculine, honor and bravery, and reduces them to this image of, old hags, who are ill and weak. And then you could talk about how this serves his purpose, link it back to the question, and the why. What kind of picture does this paint of the soldiers, and how does this help Owen achieve his purpose of showing that harsh reality of war? Link it back to the question. For your third teal, you could choose a different quote. The men marched to sleep. Many had lost their boots, but trudged on. You could look at the metaphors of how Owen portrays them as asleep, as desensitized. They're deaf, they're blind, they're lame, and how this shows the desensitizing and dehumanizing effects of war on the soldiers. And then you could look at how that furthers his purpose as well, and link it back to the question: what aspect of the harsh, what kind of harshness, is this depicting here in this particular example? And then the very last piece of your body paragraph is the concluding statement. So this is where you think, why have I bothered talking about all of this in relation to the question? And you explicitly link your ideas back to the question, reinforce the why and how effective was Owen in achieving his purpose, so you can make some kind of final evaluative statement there as well. So have a go. If you would like to do this and you want to have some feedback, feel free to email me at hello@scribehq.com.au. You can also check out my blog, where I have lots of other resources. You can also, I do online tutoring via Zoom. I have lots of workshops for literary analysis, and lots upcoming this year, really. So stay tuned. You can follow me on Facebook and Instagram. Sign up on my website for my email lists if you want to receive free resources and know what's coming up, to join my newsletter. But I'm always just a click of a button away, and happy to help however I can. Anyway, enjoy the lesson, and I'm interested to see how you go. Happy writing.